Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Clink.
Hi, Arnie. Good to see you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. Welcome, Wallace Clink.
Oh, hi, Arnie. I hope you're not plunged into winter yet.
No, not yet. Well, though, we've had some light rain, and the weather is cooling. The weather is cooling. So we're not getting the 35s anymore. We're getting the tops around 30, but the average day is around 20 now. So the weather is cooling, and the leaves are falling, and yes, it's certainly the seasons have arrived. So we can see from that the natural world is still in equilibrium, which is very important, because there are naysayers who say that the natural world is out of kilter, and that we're in a state of crisis on many fronts. I want to cut across to the papers, and then I'll open up the floor for thoughts. So the first one is in regard to lewd acts. There's actually been orgies and all that sort of stuff in our Parliament House, and there's a bit of noise coming from both sides of the political fence over it. But in actual fact, both sides of the political fence are equally at fault. New South Wales, there's a certain minister who's under question for his rape of a prostitute, and then another, if you like, equal on the other side of the political fence of the same offence. So really what they're doing is they're covering up each other, and when it's time they expose each other to tear our culture apart. In Gateway Pundit, I thought that was interesting. Cinderella is just a children's story depicted on a movie, and of course they've cancelled it because in this instance the movie has 98% of the cast are white people, and yet it's okay. There it is there, that point of view. This police officer, is being challenged, persecuted for his backing of Donald Trump as an alternative. You're not even allowed or tolerated if you happen to have a certain point of view. And of course his friendship with Roger Stone. And then of course Sidney Powell, the attorney who was exposing the voting fraud, and she's still fighting in the court. She has not given up. She's unrelenting, to her credit, even though it's obvious that the Supreme Court is stacked against her. They do not want to. They're not interested in actually considering the legal status of the election and the voter fraud that did take place. So Sidney Powell is still out there arguing. So to her credit, good work. And finally, the Green New Deal is about government control. Of course it is, not the environment. It never was about the environment. It's always about power. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, if you like, power over the people. And yet what we're seeing is a degenerate generation of leaders who are covering up sordid crimes, if you like, or their sordid involvement in practices, and it's only ever released when it suits. And we've got to come to grips with the fact that we are where we are because we accept the things that we do, and we don't actually challenge them back. And this to me is the lead-in for us to consider in today's forum, which is will be aired just preceding Easter. So your thoughts, please, Robert Clink.
Well, definitely society seems to be well advanced on the road to general disintegration. All the old precepts that people followed have been discarded, and there has been a concerted effort to subvert everything rational and everything that we formerly valued from the past. This is consistent with Marxism, or even other aspects of communist philosophy, because communism is about the capture of power. And in order to capture power, they have no concept of fairness, which most normal people still value to an extent, you know. So they are prepared to cheat in every conceivable way in order to achieve their end. In other words, the end justifies the means. And we shouldn't think that this has any limitation, because truly they will go to any lengths in order to get the result they want. And we were warned about this by Yuri Bezmenov. He had been a former KGB agent, and he went to India, and he became completely disenchanted with communism as a result of his experience in India. He saw a different way of living, and he actually ended up becoming I think a Christian. He said that, Marxism regards religion as the opiate of the people. So that's one thing that they're dedicated to erasing. And they've done a pretty good job of that in our society. But Yuri Bezmenov, I think, eventually converted to Christianity. He warned that there is a program, at that time it was being conducted out of Russia, the Soviet Union. I'm not sure today what that situation is. Some people allege that the Soviet Union has not really disappeared, that it has just withdrawn for strategic reasons. And the communists certainly have this idea that you make strategic retreats. Lenin expressed it as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Well, the net effect of that is that you're always progressing toward your goal, although you will step back just to lull people into a sense of complacency. So they think, well, things are not going as badly as we thought they were, and then they come and hammer you again. I think we're seeing this theory applied very much in the context of the current COVID controls that are being imposed on society. They relax them a bit, and then they bring them back stronger than ever. This is pure Marxist theory, Marxist practice. And I am absolutely certain that the inspiration for the COVID management in society is Marxist, because it's all designed to take away our traditional rights, the right to associate, the right to speak freely, the right to move freely. This is a cancellation of the way that our society has functioned. And it's all designed to shatter our traditions, our customs. And the effect is, if it's continued long enough, I can see it already, that people habituate themselves to the new way of doing things. It's very disappointing, actually, that people are so easily manipulated and transformed. But we're certainly learning a lesson in that regard. And unless the inspiration for what is going on, I think ultimately the inspiration is beyond Marxism. It's at some higher level of conspiracy to centralize power, which normally emanates from the financial establishment, the big international financial establishment. But they mediate their conspiratorial activity through Marxism, because they both have the same goal. Marxism ultimately wants to put all power in the hands of the state, and the financiers know that they can control the state. So if the Marxists achieve their goals, the financiers achieve theirs. They're supposedly in conflict with each other. One is allegedly a big capitalist, and the other is trying to subvert capitalism. But if you look at history, and if you think logically about what is going on, you have to conclude that they are actually allied with each other.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's quite an interesting observation. I certainly, if you like, endorse what you say about the alignment of capitalism and communism. The free market, in one of the articles in today's paper, it spoke about the free market and how so important it is to actually have free reign to do whatever. And of course, this is laissez-faire and non-accountable and just as exploitive. And the wages, if you like, of the worker are being dropped lower and lower and lower. And of course, in America, the immigration push, 2 out of 3 jobs that are available for people in the United States are now going to illegals. And so who gets the advantage of the illegals pouring in? It's obviously the big capitalists. They get the advantage. It goes directly to them. They pay less for labour. And so, of course, everyone's on a very short tenure, and conditions are just, well, you're on an hourly rate. There are no services. There's no leave. There's no holidays. There's no sick. There's no nothing. You either work or you don't eat. And so the capitalists can certainly exploit it. So yes, the alignment, in my view, is quite apparent. But the biggest issue is the cultural. What is actually going on culturally? What is actually the deconstruction? Okay, we see the denigration of our politicians and the madness that's going on, but what's actually happening is that our culture is being pushed back, and this area, this cultural Marxism policy, if you like, is very important for us to explore further. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Clink.
Oh, yes, Arnie, it's a rather complex state of affairs, and can be expanded on in great detail. But basically, you're right. They're trying to degrade our culture, which is sort of relating to our cultural heritage. In other words, what we have learned over time, in order to try and come to a realistic appreciation or understanding of the nature of life. They're trying to disrupt that altogether, to detach ourselves or society from any kind of a meaningful awareness in relation to life and its meaning, because in that way they are drawing us away from natural law. We are creations of natural law. I mean, we're part of the created universe, and that has been done according to certain principles, certain standards, certain principles which inhere within the nature of the universe. They're not a matter of opinion. But if you can take people's awareness away from reality and supplant it by abstract ideas, you can then completely disrupt the whole progress of civilization. And that, of course, is what's being done. The Marxists profess not to believe in God because God presents a challenge and a competition for them. Their idea is to control civilization, to control people, society, toward their own ends. And it's absolutely essential that their final authority in these matters is not challenged. And if you're going to posit such a thing as a God, who is supreme and superior to all things and is the originator of all things, then obviously you are placing a final obstacle in the path of those who want to control their fellow man for their own glorification, gratification, their own self-importance, and so on. And that is something that cannot be tolerated by those who are seeking absolute power over society, because it's a complete obstacle to their their ambitions.
Yeah.
So it's all very, and there's no doubt about it, an effort is being made to completely and totally destroy our culture, in the sense that an attempt is being made to degrade its ability to think constructively, meaningfully, and in a manner such to indicate that we are striving for a closeness and an understanding of divine law, natural law, law which goes beyond human conceptions about law. This is something that we have struggled with for millennia, and it is explained by the attempts of the church and others to try and come to an understanding of natural law, that law which supervenes above all other things, above all human opinion. And it's just, and part of that, of course, is to degrade our morals, our ethics, because morals and ethics lead you to make a disciplined approach to life in such a manner that indicates you think that there is a way of doing things, a right way of doing things, and that you are anxious to search, to seek for that way, to follow it and to implement it. So today, every effort is being made to, I had one of these people who contacted me periodically. He knew what I was involved in, trying to improve society, especially through the financial system. And he assured me that it was a complete waste of time, because everything is subject to the law of entropy. Well, that would be a natural law, but it's a degrading concept because it means that you're not trying to improve things. You're just giving up faith, hope, and you are acceding to a belief in hopelessness. Mm. And if there is no hope, then there is no hope. It's just that simple.
Yeah.
You have to have spirit, you have to have soul, you have to have principles, you have to have standards, something to look forward to, something to assist you in trying to improve things. Mm-hmm. If you have no faith, mm-hmm. then you've given everything up. And then what happens? You become a total victim of those who are trying to control you, because you'll no longer make an effort to resist it. There's no point in it, according to that philosophy.
Yeah.
So it's very destructive.
It certainly is.
Yeah, and if you can do this, and people can become increasingly degraded, they will, of course, naturally lose their spirit, their soul, their hope, their faith, without which you can do nothing. And at that point, you become putty in the hands of those who would seek power over you.
That's so important. Philosophy is so important. It can either give you hope and give you direction, or it can tear them asunder, tear the institution of family, of the correct relationship between husband, wife, and children, of the structure of family, of the structure of society, of kinship, of friendship. And of course, mankind has actually attempted to implement these natural laws. Britain spent hundreds of years pursuing the natural law, if you like. They called it the canon, and the canon outworked in what they understood as the common law. Magna Carta was an expression of the canon as they understood it at the time. And if I haven't done the full research, but I understand that the Magna Carta was endorsed, I think, as many as 25 or 35 times across the centuries and as late as the 1600s. But that Magna Carta evolved. It wasn't the same agreement because thinking evolved, because the institutions of culture, if you like, of parliament, of representative government, doing away with absolute authority of the king, things like that, these things evolved. And it was that power spoke to authority, and authority actually addressed power. And that was the role of the church. The church had the authority. But since, if you like, the handing over, and this is where you mentioned, Robert, you mentioned the church in Russia. And I'm of the view that the church in Russia is a captured species, as the church in England is captured by the political apparatus, if you like. It's no longer what it used to be, the centre of culture, the centre of thinking. And that stage when it was not captured, prior to Henry VIII, of course, in England, the church spoke with authority. And that in the course of what Henry VIII did, not only did the church speak against it, but there were martyrs. They stood against it unto their own death. There were martyrs, and that to me is very important. That not only they spoke with authority from the words of God, but that they were prepared to put their all to insist on that. So it really is a totally different point of view. And when you consider where we are now, the church is silent. And of course, the other culture, the other philosophy, the philosophy of cultural Marxism, is on the ascendancy because the church is not speaking. It's so, so important. Robert Clink, and I'll give you the floor for a while if you like.
All right. Well, back when Christianity was the dominant and very current philosophical influence in European society, there was a word, universe. And universe means the one word. They had a concept that lived in a system that was an expression of divinity, and that our position in that, our purpose in that, was to conform to the universe, whatever had been created and intended by God. So they had a unifying concept, but with the influence of materialism, in part this came through Darwinism, which was a concept that progress occurs through conflict, which is exactly the same position that the Marxist takes, only the Darwinist sees it in the natural world, the Marxist sees it in the human social world. With that development, the unifying idea was lost, and it got to the point where some philosophers were actually contending that everything is nothing but molecules in motion. Now, if you think of the complexity of the society we live in, the organic relationships that exist, it just boggles the mind that somebody could think that you just reduce it to molecules in motion, and this produces all the results we see about us. But I believe that the Marxists actually contended that everything comes about just through the random interaction of basic material elements. It's a concept that is very degrading, as Wally said, and destructive in the sense that it reduces everything to such a low level that you can't have higher conceptualizing of it. I think that element of this, or an aspect of this, occurred in the 1960s when they came up with the hippie drug culture. I don't believe this was an organic development. This was something that was fostered by secret services. I mean, the CIA was involved in distributing LSD. They manufactured LSD. They imported it. They did all kinds of experimentation without advising people that it was going on, and they undermined all the accepted fundamental principles of society. So no longer was marriage important. Promiscuity was nothing at all. Just the sex was just something everybody did with everybody, you know, and you didn't try to have self-control and concentrated use of your mental abilities. Instead, you tried to escape into some dream world through the use of hallucinogenics and other forms of drugs. So it was a very great revolution in the nature of our society. And it's part of the assault that had been going on. It's not just in recent years it's been going on. It's been going on for decades. But we're taken through various phases of it. And I think the 60s were used as a phase to break up the foundations of society. And now we're sort of at sea, and we don't have any tethering. We're just subject to manipulations of all kinds because we've lost our foundation. This is a foundation that we built up over centuries and even millennia. It was a basis of society that was accepted and fundamentally very successful. It didn't deliver on the promise of the advantage that technology should bring to the population. But this was a completely artificial thing. It was because we didn't adapt our monetary system to the new reality of potential abundance. But in many respects, the society was making fantastic gains in knowledge and in developing new products, exploring new worlds, looking into space and exploring the seas and everything. We had, in many respects, it was an adventurous, challenging existence. But this was when people had control over their initiative to a great extent. And now we can see that the establishment, the powers that be, want to take that initiative and that potential for adventure and exploration away from us. They've done this with their COVID experiment. I would call it an experiment. I would say it's a plot to, or in fact, it's a coup. It's just an ordinary old political coup, and the effect of it is intended to be to take away human capacity for initiative and freedom in all domains. So, you know, Dostoevsky wrote a book entitled The Devils, and it was an analysis of how the ego can become so potent in people who don't have any philosophical underpinnings and lead them to become absolute monsters to the point where they're killing anybody who dissents from their organization. In this case, it was a communist cell. And he was predicting back in the mid-19th century what would come to the world. It came initially to the Soviet Union. From there, it spread elsewhere. And now I fear that it has come home to roost in our society, unless people realize that it is based in this materialistic, conspiratorial philosophy. Marx referred to it as old mole. And he said, old mole is always working. Well, Marx is dead, but old mole continues his work. And it's a problem of human arrogance and egotism and narcissism. And these are very potent in people who are lacking humility and lacking the sense that they are part of a universe that is ordered and that they have a place in that order, that it's their duty to discover and conform to.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. That's certainly well put. We've lost, I know, we've got Wally back. There you go. So it is interesting that we've moved away from, the more we're moving away from, if you like, our moral anchor, our culture that has actually laid the foundation. The further we go away, the further into chaos we go. And when we can't look at our institutions, we can't look at our politicians. Right now in Australia, we've got essentially the whole government is cowering at the feminist push against them. They're cowering at it. They're in fear and trepidation because they have no moral anchor. And yet we have the photo shoots of the Prime Minister in the church. And I think, is this no different than the photo shoots that we see Putin in the church, where the church is essentially ineffective? It should be speaking with authority, but it's ineffective. And it's cowering at this assault from the feminist, or if you like, the cultural Marxist movement. Very important to place these, the philosophy of Marxism, if you like, into perspective, because the philosophy has its roots in Hegel, I think, the dialectic. And it's those roots that are exactly the same roots in Nazism, in fascism, as in socialism, communism. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Clink.
When you speak of Hegel, you're talking about the notion that progress or further higher developments evolve from conflict. Now, if you go to build a house and you get into conflict with all the agents who are involved, it's going to take you a long time to build a house. And it may turn out to be a rather unsatisfactory structure. It seems to me that things work out much better when you approach it from a standpoint of common purpose, goodwill, and agreement on principles and building techniques. You see, it's the Hegelian idea was in the idea of the realm of ideas. Marx took that concept of conflict, the thesis versus the antithesis, leading to synthesis. He took it and he applied it to the physical economy. But it's the same principle of violence leading to progress. And it's a death wish on society or civilization, because it can only lead to a degradation of the quality of that society, and with that, a degradation of its ability to achieve, and with that, a degradation of the ability to enjoy the process as a magnificent experience, adventure. We are being told that everything we do is a violation of nature, that we're destroying the natural world. When we attempt to employ the forces and resources in that natural world in order to do things which are essentially constructive. In other words, the people who are engineering the social reconstruct, they're really enemies of civilization, because civilization justifies the present way of doing things, in a sense. And they're to completely discredit it for the very simple reason that they want to achieve power. And you can't achieve power over people when people are relatively, it's difficult to do when people are relatively satisfied with their situation in life. You've not only got to come along and tell them that things are no good, but you have to actually engineer events so that they in fact are less desirable. And so that's what's being done. That's the technique of revolution. And that is, I am convinced, what is very much involved in this so-called COVID viral hysteria. It's not dealing with reality. I mean, as one medical person told me, if you take a baby, the best way to destroy that baby is to put that baby in a plastic or a glass bubble, totally, completely isolated from the forces and influences in the real world. That baby will then develop no resistance, no, and of course, if the baby were to be taken out of the bubble, it would become immediately subject to all of these things which normally human beings, like other beings, with which they interact and which they develop coping mechanisms. So you can see that this extreme policy of separating people, social, I call it anti-social distancing, ritualistic practices of hygiene that are dominating our lives and dictating our activities from day to day, from hour to hour. We're being obsessed with things which we have a natural capacity to adjust and to deal without all of this Chicken Little, the sky is falling attitude, hysteria. The people who seek power, that's like political and economic planning in Britain, which was an offshoot of the London School of Economics. The source of Keynesian economics being spread all over the world. The type of economics which has enslaved people to increasing debt and perpetual debt. So you have, we are beings which are created within the natural environment and universe, not to perish immediately upon our emergence on the scene, but to prevail and to exist and to deal with life. But you see there, the people who are trying to exercise this quest for power, they are telling us that we have to be fearful. Not that we should look forward to life, but that we should look at something that contains within it our nemesis, the elements of our destruction, not our life. And they are trying to railroad us into all sorts of enslaving behavior, like the Pharisees of old, which we were freed from 2,000 years ago, into vain oblations and just an endless series of behaviors which betray our insecurity and suggest that we have no reasonable hope for a positive life in this world.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wally. I've only got to place my consideration towards our current cowering Prime Minister in the face of media suggestions of his misogyny or his essentially collective guilt as being a white male towards the feminists, towards women generally. And it's to the point where if you like, you consider the act of sex, and obviously the male is guilty, and guilty as charged, and there's no question of mitigating circumstances nor mutual consent in it. The woman is obviously being exploited, and how could she not be exploited because of the dominant male? When in actual fact, my understanding of sex is that it's an agreement between two people, and if there is lewd acts, it's because both of them are involved in those acts. So it's equally, if you like, equal guilt with it, and not one guilty and the other one, of course, not guilty. This I find it fascinating because you look at the situation with was it Julian Assange and the laws in Sweden, where he was somehow or other, there was some sort of rape charge against him, and it was a consensual sex, and there's rape come out of it, and it's just, well, hang on a sec, what is this over? And honestly, obscure oblations, you don't even know what you've done wrong, and of course, what is the law for? What is the law to uphold? It's actually to uphold security and sanctity, and if you like, rights, property rights, or rights of freedom of movement and things like that. That's what the purpose of the law. But its purpose has been circumvented, and of course, yes, as you say, Wally, the Pharisee has taken over. It's dominating. It's thinking that everywhere, every which way you turn, of course, there's a threat that you're breaching something. And of course, with the never satisfied feminist, and of course that's the cultural Marxism deconstructing the family and the role of the male. The role of the male is being deconstructed, but at the same time the role of the female is being deconstructed and asserted that her only, if you like, expression or opportunity for expression is to become a male. Is to become the breadwinner and be assertive and dominant, and of course the quotas being called for within the political parties, but also within the film industry, whether it's ability or the actual narrative, but you've got to come into the political correct realm. And of course, was Jesus white, or was he black, or was he yellow, green, brown, or brindle? What was he? Because the politically correct narrative doesn't accept the facts that are on the ground. I noted this when I was reading Keith Windschuttle's books about Australian history, and in the case of the Aboriginals in Tasmania, and of course the claims against the collective white guilt. 200 years later, everyone's guilty because you're white. 200 years later, I find that an incident where a supposed genocide took place of slaughter of 100 Aboriginals, and you think anyone would be abhorrent, would be disgusted with such an event. But in actual fact, what it was a fight over a kangaroo, and that the kangaroo had been shot, and there was claims against the kangaroo, and in the scuffle, 2 Aboriginals were killed. It doesn't mean that white man wasn't killed by Aboriginals in Tasmania. That certainly did occur. But that in this instance 2 Aboriginals were killed, but the narrative doesn't satisfy the politically correct, so they came up with a genocide of 100, the slaughter of 100, when in actual fact it was a fight over a kangaroo. And so that's the narrative. The facts on the ground don't if you like, appease these the philosophy. They don't appease the philosophy of deconstructing our culture. And it really, really is important to recognise that there is purpose, there is intent in what's going on. It's not only the deconstructing of the culture, it's not only the deconstructing of the foundations of liberty, which is inherent within the root of Christian faith, Christian philosophy, but it's also that in amongst that, when you're trying to actually ascertain what is actually going on, you realise that at the same time you're being financially enslaved. So it's a combination of many fronts. It's a hydra, many heads coming at you, psychologically, philosophically, financially, economically, disenfranchised. All these things are coming at you. All these hydras are coming at you to deconstruct civilization. It is a deliberate intent. It is the purpose or the policy of cultural Marxism to do this, to destroy our culture. And the only response back, the only response to it, is to actually look at the truth of the situation and then also look at natural law. What is the correct relationship between a man and a woman? The church says, the canon law says, that the relationship is one of mutual love, cooperation and respect. Mutual love, cooperation and respect. None of that is being presented in the case of what's going on in our newspapers at the moment. None of it. It's basically hatred towards white, towards male, towards Christian, towards any sort of cultural development. It's hatred towards it. Why? Why is it so? Because it's actually an anti-human pathology. That's what it's about. And that's why we have these euthanasia laws coming up and any sort of question of actually being able to treat children who may be suffering from some form of dysphoria. Treating children to actually reorientate them back to, if you like, their natural, their biological state. And these laws are coming against it. This is deliberate. It is the purpose and intent is to deconstruct us, to get us to the point where we can't even trust the man or woman next to us. We can't trust them. And so we've got to put masks over our face. We've got to hide our whole facial expression. Because if you take just the eyes, you miss out on so much facial expression. But it's below that can give emphasis, can give smile, can give us whatever, the different things. It can give that the intensity and all that. So there is a certain amount. But the face is such an expressive form of communication. And to hide that, of course, is hiding communication. It's stunting communication. It's stunting the opportunity for us to actually pass on our cultural inheritance, which is rich. Your thoughts, please, and we'll look at the time. And closing comments, please, Robert Clink.
Well, you're certainly right, Arnie, that it is a multifaceted, omnidirectional attack. And they've got their foot in the door in the past, and now they are coming at us from every direction. So whereas we once assumed we had a pattern of life that we could expect looking into the future, it has all been disturbed and undermined, and there is constant effort made to throw everything into doubt and to question it. The purpose is to find some kind of difference, some kind of cleavage in society. And certainly the cleavage between the sexes is one of these. So they find a cleavage and they play on it and they reinterpret it, and they develop antagonisms and hostilities as a result of the way they represent it. And then they play the people who have accepted these views of how things are just like puppets. We can see this in so many different areas. And one of them is the cleavage between the present and the past. And at the present time, there is an attempt to completely deracinate us from our history. You know, they are reevaluating all cultural creations that were done in the past that were valued by the criteria, totally arbitrary criteria that have developed recently in the context of political correctness. Well, this means that virtually every cultural creation of the past is subject to being discredited. When they tear down statues, I'm sure that some of the statues are representing people who had some pretty pleasant, pretty unpleasant aspects in their lives. But still they constitute a part of our history. We can always learn more about the history, but to just tear it all down and say it shouldn't be presented to the current generation is just a violence that is intended to separate us from our moorings. We'll have no more moorings soon. You know, I'm wondering at what point, and I'm sure it's coming, the works of Shakespeare, the most amazing creative writer, I think probably in any culture, are going to come under attack. They have come under attack to a degree, certain of his plays, but if you look at Shakespeare's plays, they were the product of a culture, and they were an expression of Christian views. And they can all be analyzed in such a way that they are considered to be unacceptable in modern times. So we're going to end up with all our streets renamed, all our cities renamed, all our cultural creations discredited. And this is just an attack on the foundations that give us a substance and a solidity in our lives. Once they can get you floating free, then they can do with you whatever they want. And this is a standard Marxist tactic. It's been played over and over. It even precedes Marxism. If you go back to Adam Weishaupt and his influence on the French Revolution, they went through the same things that we're going through now. It's just a repetition of this revolutionary tactics that has been played out. I'm not sure how far it goes back, but certainly to the mid 17th century. And the strategies and tactics are very well understood. They've been enunciated by theoreticians, and they're just repeating them in our time. It's very unfortunate, but people are not as aware of the history of these things as they ought to be, because it would give them a measure of protection against the plotting of these people who want to absolutely destroy society in all its aspects. And they believe they will pick up the pieces and have their way with the world. Well, they're going to discover that what they create is going to have its way with them too. The trouble is that we're going to go through very unpleasant times while this process is being worked through. And the people who want to conserve what is valuable in our society have to resist this. They have to be made aware of the planning, the attempts to undermine their way of life and to actively resist it, to combat it. Now, this isn't all. You've got to find a way to resist it. But since we've got into this mess, obviously we're subject to getting into it again. And the way to avoid that is to fix the financial system, because the financial system is the reason for people's dependency and for their sycophancy and for their inability to express themselves, their inner selves, what they really are as individuals, and to resist being dominated by an external force. So social credit was the key to eliminate that control, and to the freeing of the individual, to providing him with absolute economic security so that he could control his life as he chooses.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much for that, Robert Clink. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Clink.
Well, yes, Arnie, you know, I think if we're going to zero in, really zero in on the issue, we have to say that love is the basis of all meaningful association. The financial system, however, as a materialistic influence, has a complete monopoly over issuing the licenses to live. That is, the monetary units which we use in order to claim the services and goods that are offered by others of our species. So without this, and that's why these people tend to be so vicious, these revolutionaries, because they absolutely detest, they hate, they have a visceral hatred of Christianity because Christianity stresses the loving relationships amongst human beings and in relationship to their maker. So they have to engage in a relentless attempt to destroy any and every constructive development which might strengthen faith and in turn hope and love, those things which lead to activity which has positive outcomes. They have to sabotage all that. And it's been their policy all through, as you mentioned, the French Revolution, the revolutionary period in Europe during the early mid 1800s, the revolution in Russia, that enormous cataclysm that occurred and a social disaster in the revolution that occurred in China, Cambodia. Millions of people whose lives were destroyed, ruined and destroyed, because essentially of the idea that we live in a universe of scarcity, and allegedly we have to struggle within that scarcity amongst each other in order to survive. When in fact we have an abundance and a potential abundance which completely obviates any such considerations of scarcity. No such thing. We have an abundance that we don't know what to do with. As I've said before, if you can afford to destroy whole continents in cataclysmic wars, if you can afford to do that, and then come out at the end more wealthy than you were in the beginning, there's something wrong with the theory of scarcity. We don't live. If we live within scarcity, it's a scarcity of our own making, of our own engineering. And it has nothing to do with the real organic situation. So we live, we have chosen to, some of us, not us, but some people have fallen to prey to the idea that we were living in scarcity and that life is a struggle instead of a pleasure. And that means that we are essentially all at war with each other, struggling over a limited source of physical and cultural wealth. It's a lie. It's an enormous, grand lie. But it has wrought havoc on the whole experience that is human civilization. So we really have to. I mean, Marx came along with the idea that, and there's no doubt about it, there were terrible conditions during that period, but those conditions were brought about by the existing social structure or order and the financial system in which it attempted to survive. And that financial situation, as you were saying, Arnie, it's got nothing to do with reality, except that it can be used to make life hell for people. And whereas it could also be used to release the creative powers of initiative that reside within the human mind and the human soul, and could be a complete emancipation for mankind. We don't need to look for emancipation in the destruction of the capitalist. The capitalist, as such, all societies are capitalist if they use tools. It's the use to which they're put that is important, and which determines the validity of the system. So, I mean, there's no reason in the world why we could not be living in an existence of heaven on earth. Well, that's what Jesus told us. He said, if you seek the kingdom of God, and which I take it to be the kingdom of love, all these other things, you will no longer have to work with the struggle with the sweat of your brow. These things will be given unto you. They will be given unto you. And that's what we pray for in the Lord's Prayer. We don't pray for more work. We pray for adequate bread. So you see, I mean, we were put into a universe that is entirely satisfactory, but certain destructive, power-seeking elements have intervened to sabotage what could be the kingdom of God on earth.
Mm. Yeah, heaven on earth. That's beautifully put, Wally. And that actually leads us, I think it leads us beautifully into the season of Easter. Why did God come? Why did he suffer on the cross for us? And what truths, those profound truths that were uttered from the words that he spoke, those profound truths actually set us free. They actually reveal the nature of things. I think of you say the trick, the coin, it was to do with, what was it to do with? Was it to do with taxes? Well, actually, the more you study the coin, the inscription, whose inscription is on there? Well, it is Caesar's. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but unto God the things that are God's. So it's a Trinitarian relationship between the individual, government, and authority or God. That's the relationship. It's a Trinity in unity. And it is that government is not to impose onto the areas of God this freedom, this ability to actually find expression of the individual. Government is not to do that. And it turned, while it legitimized government, it turned their power answerable to authority, and that was the church. And that's why Henry VIII, it was such a destructive time, and it was under the guidance of Thomas Cromwell, but I think Thomas Cromwell, well, that was actually a front man for other powers that were behind the scenes. And of course we saw that outworking and expression in the end. It was of course the merchant-led invasion, 1688, William of Orange, where they took over the crown. They had no issue with absolute power of the monarch Henry VIII being transferred, of course, after he had brought both crowns onto his own head, the crown of the government and the crown of church, and so you had the Trinity thrown out of whack. And then they placed that into the hands of Parliament. And that's what we're looking at since then. We've seen that in the House of Lords, 1911 was emasculated, where the House of Lords could not actually withhold supply any further from the House of Commons, and that was reinforced in 1949. And then with the party system, the voice of the people is unheard. It's unheard in the halls of Parliament. And of course, this is the imbalance that we're experiencing. the imbalance. So we've deconstructed the things that have been built up over millennia. We've deconstructed them, and it's quite a deliberate policy. There's purpose behind it, and that's what we're looking at. So would they crucify Christ again? Yes, they would. In their pursuit of power, they would crucify Christ again. And it's up to us. It's up to those who understand what's going on, who recognise what's going on, and accept the calling. If you would save this life, you will lose it. But if you will give up this life for the sake of my kingdom, then you will gain it. It's your eternal soul that is of question here. Not your physical body, not this physical life, but your eternal soul. That is what the Christian message is about. That's the profundity of it. It's the soul that is raised from the dead. It's the soul that's brought back to life. It's the soul that actually has communion with the God of creation. And that to me is the key to the message that we have. Douglas uncovered some truths. I call them natural laws, and they are. They're actually the canon, to do with the correct relationship of the economic system, of the financial system, the correct relationship of the political system to the individual, and of course the outworking of those systems in society, the societal systems. That's why they're deconstructing them, because they're actually attempting to destroy the world. This is an anti-God or anti-human movement, and we ignore it at our peril. We ignore it at our peril, or we recognise it and accept the Great Commission. The Great Commission to take the gospel into the whole world, and this is part of that gospel. Accept that commission. It really is a challenge, and this is a very, very important season that we saw that God himself chose to come and be perfect man, and he exposed himself to all the rigours and all the sufferings of this life, and thought it worthwhile. Thought it worthwhile. He experienced it, the life that we see and we feel every day. He experienced it himself. And it was treachery and tyranny that caused him to be executed, but he overcame death. And what a powerful, powerful message. Freedom has its roots in Christianity, and on this freedom is an opportunity to find expression. And part of that expression is to recognise that your soul is important, that the salvation that is there with the Easter message is fundamental, and that those truths of the universe, they transcend human thinking, that God is and God upholds the world that we live in and experience. Thank you so much for today's forum, Wallace and Robert, and to our audience, happy Easter.
Same to you, Arnie.
Yeah, thanks, Arnie.
No worries, my pleasure.